The autumn breeze carried a gentle chill as it wafted through the teeming market square in Boston, an inland town of Lincolnshire, England. It was the fall of the year 1313, but it could have been today, as the market's popularity still puts this town on the map. It was there and then when a Frenchman, Nicholas Duval, would venture over the English Channel from the port city of Caen to sell his wares in the Boston market. On this trip, he had done quite well. So Nicholas took some of the profit and he gave it to his trusty servant, Simon Basil, to deliver to Nicholas's family back in France. Nicholas had 50 pounds sterling sewn into Simon's jacket lining and sent him on his way. Trying to impress his master, Simon determined to get back to France as fast as he could. He traveled swiftly by day and walked deep into the night under the dark, moonless sky. Simon soon came upon a river known today as the Little Ouse in Cambridgeshire. But somehow, someway, Simon Basil lost his footing, tumbled into the water, and drowned. After recovering Simon's body, an inquest was commissioned. Who was this man? Where was he from? Where was he going? Why did he have all that money sewn into his jacket? And how on earth did he die? All of these questions would not be answered, but enough for the bailiffs to rule Simon's death an accident, and under the law of the land, consider declaring the 50 pounds sterling as Deodand. Now, this is an out-of-date legal term today, but for hundreds of years, Deodand put a price on accidental harm. If a pedestrian was killed by a runaway horse, the horse would be declared Deodand, sold, and the money given to the poor. If a cart trampled a child, or a kettle brimming with boiling lye scalded a worker to death, cart and kettle would become Deodand, the Latin origins of the word literally meaning given to God. The Bishop of Ely, who owned the land where Simon died, figured that the money Simon was carrying weighed him down, causing him to slip into the river, then carry him to the bottom where he drowned. Hence, the money should be considered Deodand and given to the bishop to dispense to the poor. And that's what happened until Nicholas Duval heard about the accident. He requested an audience with the bishop, explained who Simon was and what he'd been up to, and convinced the bishop to give Nicholas back his money, which the bishop did. Deodand, given to God. And what worked for medieval villagers to help them get past the tragic randomness of life still works for many people today, like Jesse, Amanda, and Kip, who have been bound together by both tragedy and Deodand, given to God. These are the folks we'll meet today alongside their challenges and endurance, brokenness and bravery, anger and hope in this episode of On Accident. On Accident examines the exceedingly capricious nature of life and the stunningly resilient nature of some of the people who move through it. Yes, we live in an accidental world where once every 18 minutes in the U.S., somebody unintentionally kills somebody, and someone unintentionally causes serious harm 10 times as often. And while the guilt, shame, and emotional turmoil experienced by unintentional harm can have devastating effects, somehow, someway, we move through it. And in one of life's mysterious twists, we often find that these things make us more empathetic, mature, even better people. My name is Chris Yaw, and today we are in Morel, Ohio. If you're Googling Morel, Ohio right now, you won't find much. Morel is actually more of a hamlet. The last official census put the population at 399 people. Its closest big town is Marion, and Marion's closest big town is Columbus. Morel was named for the man whose farm once stood here and is still surrounded by that heritage today, much of it corn. The shiny silver silos at the heart of the downtown are the town's most striking feature. And it was here on a warm July evening in 2010 where 16-year-old Jesse Shrake, a new and cocky driver, had a need for speed.
speed's kind of this fun thing. There's this level of, I guess there's a level of kind of danger that gets your adrenaline going. And a little bit of it certainly was me kind of showing off because I was the only one there that had my license.
On this day, Jesse, who received his driver's license 6 months earlier and before his best friend, would spend the afternoon playing games, video games, before getting behind the wheel of a 1993 Ford Explorer with his best friend who sat in front and his two younger brothers, ages 12 and 15, who sat in back. It was 8:45 p.m. and the boys were heading to their school to do some volunteer work. While Morel has few people, it has miles and miles of country roads, long, empty roads. Quite a temptation for a young, inexperienced driver who admits to putting the pedal to the metal from the moment he hopped into that SUV that night. Why do 16-year-olds drive so fast, so recklessly? Experts say there's a biological reason, that areas of the brain that control decision-making don't fully develop until early adulthood. So a 16-year-old's brain places him at greater risk of being reactive in his decision-making and less able to consider the consequences of his choices. And it gets worse if he feels pressured, stressed, or in search of the attention of others. In fact, researchers say there's a difference between cold and hot situations. Cold situations are the choices made during times of low emotional stress or arousal. At these times, teens can seem just like adults. But then there are hot situations, where the choices made come during periods of high emotional arousal, when they're anxious, upset, excited, or trying to impress. Hot situations will increase the chance of a teenager's risk-taking and sensation-seeking behaviors. He will exhibit little self-control or logical consideration of the possible consequences of his actions. And tonight, Jesse's situation was hot. "90 miles an hour for about 5 miles, whizzing past cornfield after cornfield. Then onto Bear Road went Jesse and his car full of friends. They approached a stop sign, one that Jesse did not want to obey. And he's not alone. Traffic research shows most people don't like stopping at stop signs. And if they're installed in a neighborhood to slow traffic down, this has often had the opposite effect, as drivers actually speed up between signs to make up for the lost time. Our disdain, and hence disregard for them, may be the reason why twice as many people are killed at intersections with stop signs than those with traffic lights, as most of us don't come to a complete stop as the law stipulates. Most reasons have to do with impatience or inattention, but other common reasons are that nobody else was coming, that we were distracted by things like radios, cell phones, or passengers. Being in a hurry is another cause, as is peer pressure, which is what Jesse was feeling. So as he approached the stop sign on Bear Road, he asked his passengers if any other vehicles could be seen, which would have been hard to determine given the size of the late July corn, which at 6 feet high surrounded the intersection. So there was little way to tell if there was anyone else around until you got to the stop sign and stopped, which was not in Jesse's plans. Neither, of course, was the approaching minivan.
Right as I was kind of coming into the intersection is when I saw the blur kind of go in front of me. And, and then that was the point of impact.
Jesse's Ford Explorer had hit that minivan, driven by a grandma, Jane Watts, and her 18-month-old granddaughter, Briar Reddig. She was riding in back. They were innocently headed toward home.
So I T-boned them right behind the driver's door, right on that sliding door.
Surprisingly, Jesse did not lose consciousness and kept the Explorer from flipping as it straddled the edge of a ditch, narrowly missing a telephone pole and finally coming to rest in the street, upright 75 yards past the intersection. The two youngsters in the back seat were very much alive, reporting mild injuries, one to the leg, But Jesse's best friend, who was riding in the front passenger seat, was no longer there, and an intact windshield and an open passenger door suggested he had fallen out at some point during the ordeal. So Jesse wiggled out of the car to look for his best friend, and soon found him in a nearby field. He was hurt pretty badly, moaning and breathing really erratically. Though he was still alive, and Jesse tried to get a more conscious response, he couldn't. This is when Jesse realized he had likely struck another vehicle. So he got up and he walked 75 yards back to the intersection to investigate. There, Jesse found an annihilated minivan, T-boned at the sliding door, but with no one inside.
Because I didn't really understand, how severe this was. I'm looking at this van that's just absolutely obliterated, but my 16-year-old mind doesn't go, oh, no one's walking out of this. It was okay, good. They're with someone who could probably help them more than I can.
Figuring that the survivor or survivors must have been well enough to walk, Jesse suspected they had taken harbor in a nearby house. So he walked back to his friends, and then he heard moaning, coming from the grass nearby. This is when he saw Jane Watts, the grandma, in the ditch, barely alive. Jesse tried to render aid, but didn't know what to do, so he went back to his friends. At this point, rescue personnel began arriving at the scene, tending to the injured and trying to figure out what had happened, as word spread like proverbial wildfire through this small town, almost immediately to the father of the small girl in the minivan, Kip Reddig, who had been separated from Briar's mother. He lived just a few miles away. His neighbors awakened him from a nap and told him about the crash.
It was a very sinking moment at that point. It's that whole gut feeling, what am I in for? I felt sick to my stomach.
Kip rushed to the scene where he saw emergency personnel tending to Jane. He also saw Jesse's best friend writhing in the street as medics treated him, and a helicopter flying overhead.
It's confusion at that point. It's trying to take it all in. There's lights and flashing lights and people running everywhere, and you just don't know what to think.
Kip could not find his young daughter, Briar. Apparently, the little girl had been ejected from the minivan, car seat and all, and had flown 50 yards into the air and planted in a cornfield like a javelin. She'd been taken to the hospital by that helicopter by the time Kip arrived. Upon hearing this, Kip headed to the hospital as well. Meanwhile, Briar's mother, Amanda, who was separated from Kip, just happened to be at the hospital. She was undergoing some routine and unrelated tests when she heard what had happened.
I think initially it was just shock. That my mind went so many different directions.
Amanda was not the only one dazed and confused. Jesse, the 16-year-old driver who caused all of this, was still at the scene as what had happened began to sink in.
This is that moment where, oh my gosh, like this woman's dead. And now in my head, my best friend's dying.
In the immediate aftermath of any sort of serious unintentional harm, most of us exhibit classic symptoms of trauma. Our adrenaline is pumping, our minds are racing, all sense of time is lost, horrid images play and replay across the movie screens of our minds in endless and unstoppable loops as we try to piece together what just happened. For most of us, it's the worst experience of our lives. Here's how a driver named Ellen, who unintentionally struck and killed a young boy in Utah years ago, describes it.
The minutes before the police arrived at the accident scene were the worst minutes of my life. I don't remember all of it, but I do remember the sense of horror and terror gripping me. I was feral in those minutes, worried about my own survival, convinced the knot of witnesses and others would kill me if they found me. And even as I shook with fear, I kept picturing the moment of impact. He was just a little boy. So fragile. I spent hours at the accident scene while the police investigated. They told me the child had died. I rode wave after wave of grief, guilt, shock, and fear. And then I was home and all I could think about was what happened. There was a slideshow constantly playing in my mind with one horrible image after another. I was afraid to leave my apartment. I went from tears of grief to trembling in fear to shameful moments of rage at the child for running in front of my car. And hours would go by and I had no idea how the time passed or what I'd been doing.
Coming up, how Jesse, Kip, Amanda, and their families handled the worst experience of their lives, as On Accident continues. Welcome back to On Accident. I'm Chris Yaw. Wanting to show off to peers, 16-year-old Jesse Shrake ran a stop sign at 90 miles an hour, struck a minivan, killing 65-year-old Jane Watts, and seriously injuring 18-year-old Briar Reddig in the small rural town of Morel, Ohio. We pick up our story in the hours following the crash, in the bustling hallways of nearby Marion General Hospital, where many of the residents of this close-knit town have flocked to hear news of the crash and its victims. This is where Kim and Amanda Reddig have just learned that Amanda's mother, Jane, has died. Jane was a well-known, highly respected, and newly retired school teacher who knew everyone in town. In fact, she was the mayor of Morel. But of course, to her only child, Amanda, she was much more.
My mom and I were super close, super like daily. We were involved in each other's lives on a daily basis.
Jane owned a farm with 25 horses. She loved animals and was known as the local dog warden, willing to care for animals no one else wanted. Jane did all of this while helping tend to her grandchildren and caring for her ailing husband in a nearby nursing home who suffered from dementia.
My mom was like one of the most influential and strongest people that I think has ever walked the earth.
Part of Jane's kind disposition and love for children was not lost on Amanda, who, as we will see, would react to this tragedy with uncommon compassion. Meanwhile, also, while at the hospital, Amanda and Kip were just learning how seriously injured their 18-month-old daughter, Briar, was. She was suffering from lacerations to her tiny liver and spleen, and was being airlifted yet again, this time to Children's Hospital in Columbus, where the full extent of her injuries was still unknown.
The first 2 days, I truly believe I was just so overcome with worry over my daughter and the devastation of the loss. I didn't have time to really calculate the other emotions in there of anger.
But anger was growing as the community and Kip began hearing details of the accident through the town chatter at the hospital and police interviews. Kip says one officer shared with him more than 200 crash site photos, pointing to negligence and recklessness. It became apparent that Jesse was seriously at fault in this crash.
I was very frustrated and angry. I was just blown away at that point.
But surprisingly, anger is not where Amanda went. From the moment she put the pieces together that Jesse had not intentionally meant to cause the crash, she says she felt compassion. So when she bumped into Jesse at the hospital, knowing that he was the driver who killed her mother and seriously injured her daughter, Amanda just had to say something to him, but probably not what you'd think.
I told him that I loved him and that I forgave him and that God had already forgiven him. He needed to forgive himself and that the two of us were in this together. It's just the heart that God's given me is just that, you know, it wasn't his intention to kill someone. It wasn't his intention to almost kill that baby or his friends.
While this attitude certainly helped Jesse, it did not take away his relentless thoughts of guilt, shame, and remorse that filled his mind. Humans are not designed to take the lives of other humans with impunity, and the sticky thoughts and images of that day haunted Jesse.
It was just this constant, thought process of like, there's a woman that's dead because of me. And that just wouldn't go away.
We can learn a bit about trauma from professional auto racing. Yes, this is where thrills, excitement, and bragging rights are at stake, but one reason sponsors stay involved in professional racing is because it can be an unparalleled and fertile field to improve vehicle safety. Bumpers, metals, plastics, safety harnesses are just a few of the many components of modern passenger cars that were either invented or perfected on a racetrack. And one thing race fans notice when a car crashes at high speeds, perhaps by taking a turn badly or clipping a competitor's automobile, a rather dramatic episode unfurls. As the car rolls, side panels fly off, wheels roll away, and the dashboard detaches as a sturdy roll cage emerges, protecting its precious cargo inside as it finally comes to rest. And oftentimes we look on and marvel, for amidst the wholesale wreckage of this car, a driver pops out and walks away, seemingly unscathed. That roll cage, inconspicuous and unnoticed when the car is all together, is suddenly revealed as the lifesaver and critical component it is. That roll cage is our trauma response. Kip, Amanda, and Jesse are seeing the doors, wheels, and dashboards of their lives completely detach. Their everyday rhythms and priorities are spinning out of control as the things they had held so dearly undergo such duress. How will the crash end? When and where will the tumbling car come to rest? What will we look like when we emerge from the wreckage? What follows their crash is their trauma response, which, like a roll cage, is designed to keep them safe, to protect them, to help see them through the crash so that they may emerge relatively unscathed. No, our trauma response is not bad. It is meticulously designed to carry us through. Psychologist and researcher Mary Catherine McDonald says that contrary to what many people think, the trauma response is not a sign of weakness or dysfunction. Rather, traumatic symptoms are the result of our natural adaptive systems. Our bodies are working to get us through an onset of overwhelm, an upside-down world, a decimation of what was amidst an unknown unfurling of what is. And in everyone, that trauma response is a bit different, as we'll see with Amanda, Kip, and Jesse. As we've heard from Amanda, within days of the crash, she had decided she needed to forgive Jesse, that it would be best for her and her family.
Oh, the piece where the lawyers are doing all the configuring and figuring out that piece of it. I'm sure that there were times when I felt some kind of way about the situation, but God never allowed me to fall into those depths. And I'm so thankful, because anger destroys you.
But as the days passed and the aftermath of the crash unfurled, difficulties set in. Breyer had taken a turn for the worse. After 28 days at Children's Hospital in Columbus, her healing was not going as expected, and she had to be airlifted to Salt Lake City for a specialized pediatric spinal surgery. Then there was Amanda's other child, 10-year-old Calvin, who was home at the time of the crash and would not take this tragedy well. Calvin was very close with his grandmother. Amanda not only shouldered with taking care of Breyer in the hospital, but her father in a rest home, who, as you remember, had dementia and had been cared for by Jane, was now dependent on Amanda, who says these huge new responsibilities meant Calvin was put on a shelf.
My son struggled enormously with the trauma of the loss. He had essentially stopped emotionally maturing at the age of 10.
Amanda says Calvin did what a lot of us do. He personalized the accident. Calvin repeatedly said, "If I had been there, Grandma would not have died." In doing so, Calvin was giving voice to what psychologists say is a common way of reacting to major crisis. Calvin was on to the first of what are called the 3 P's of personalization, perseverance, and permanence. Personalization says that no matter the crisis, humans have a tendency to take an outside share of the blame, personally, as evidenced by Calvin's conviction that he somehow could have prevented his grandmother's death. We rehearse strategies we could have taken, things we should have brought up in conversations with Grandma, or we hunt for missed cues we should have picked up on. Because of our self-centered nature, we think these things revolve around us instead of the other way around. Pervasiveness is another reaction. We tend to believe that in a major tragedy, such as Calvin's loss of his grandmother, every other area of our lives will also be completely devastated. We cannot be a good student. We cannot be a good child, parent, or friend. We cannot excel at work, athletics, or relationships. In other words, a tragedy in one area of our lives necessitates ruin in every other area of our lives. The third P is permanence. This is the conviction that we'll never get over it. In this case, grandmother's death. Permanence says that from here on out, things will be forever altered. There will be no returning to better times and no smooth sailing ahead, that this tragedy has forever altered our ability to bounce back, to be productive, reliable, or fulfilled. In reality, all 3 P's, personalization, pervasiveness, and permanence, are totally false. The crisis occurred regardless of our participation. Crisis in one area of our lives does not necessitate the ruin of every other part of our lives. And the idea that we're forever destroyed by the tragedies we encounter is certainly rarely proven to be the case. But talking ourselves out of the 3 P's is no easy task. And it was just one more heavy responsibility laid on Amanda's back. She was spent, she was too busy to seek counseling, and now, pained, strained, and drained, Amanda went looking for relief, and not in all the right places.
I'll be very honest. I didn't have time to take care of me emotionally. I did develop an unhealthy relationship with alcohol.
Alcohol and coping. Having a drink is the first place a lot of us turn to unwind after a hard day of work, to loosen up at a party, and to soothe the sorrows and stressors that come across our paths. Alcohol slows down the central nervous system, creating feelings of relaxation. And while it reduces inhibition, it also lessens our judgment and fogs our memories. Because of this, alcohol becomes a way to mask, avoid, and distance ourselves from stressors, challenges, and traumas we face. While drinking may be the most socially acceptable and easiest way to deal with things we don't want to handle, we find that avoiding, delaying, and putting off the challenges and hurt does nothing to help us do the hard work of facing and coping with the hard stuff before us. The dangers of using alcohol to cope are many. They include an increased chance of addiction, especially if this runs in our families. It also makes it much more likely we'll damage our relationships with others. It can create a distance between us and our loved ones, often contributing to anger, fighting, and irresponsible behavior. Drinking to cope also keeps us from developing alternate and healthier coping skills. When alcohol becomes a crutch, it turns into a barrier between us and more adaptive and effective coping strategies. And Amanda was not alone in reaching for a bottle. So did Kip.
I was super angry and thinking, how can you kill someone? And it affects you in so many ways. And I didn't do well. I was not a nice person to be around. I lost some friends. I did drink way too much.
Kip's descent into binge drinking, anger, and depression caused him to lash out at Jesse, talking badly about him and wishing Jesse could know the depth of pain and suffering he'd caused him and his family. And Kip knew he was hurting. He knew he should talk to someone. He tried, he says. It didn't work.
I did seek some counsel, and it didn't do me any good because I wasn't ready and I wasn't receptive.
Meanwhile, Jesse, who was just coming to grips with the tragedy he had caused, was more receptive to therapy. He says it became a lifeline.
A lot of my counseling was focused around me just taking responsibility for my anger, for my feelings, and distributing them appropriately.
Unintentional killers are not victims. Jesse did not lose his mother or watch his daughter suffer. No, he had caused these things, which brought him injuries of his own. Jesse would grapple with shame, guilt, and the challenges of forgiveness. His was a moral injury, one that will never completely go away, says author and chaplain David Peters.
We can never really undo what happened. We can never really get that thing that they used to call closure before 9/11. We used to talk about getting closure a lot, but ultimately that's an impossible thing to get.
Amidst these challenges, Jesse now had serious criminal proceedings to face. He was looking at several felony charges, carrying penalties in excess of 25 years in prison, a long time for a 16-year-old. Kip thought Jesse deserved to serve every minute of it.
He will never understand the complexity of what he has caused for not just Briar, but immediate family and extended family. He doesn't realize the impact.
But Amanda thought Jesse should be treated differently. She took an active role in advocating for Jesse, lobbying the prosecutors and judges not to punish him further. Like her mother, the school teacher, Amanda wanted to help this high schooler the best way she could.
My heart broke for this kid because, he wasn't malicious in his intent of what happened. He wasn't, trying to cause the devastation that he caused. And we're talking about his life, essentially his entire life, being spent in a prison or something of that nature. And it didn't set well with me, and it wasn't acceptable to me.
In the end, the judge listened to Amanda. Jesse was sentenced to 90 days in jail, which was lowered to 30 days and could be served on weekends and holidays, so Jesse didn't have to miss school. His license would be revoked for 7 years. He would be on probation for 5, had to pay $3,000 in restitution, and perform community service. Jesse knows how lucky he was.
Had it not been for Amanda telling them, no, one, that's not what my mother would have wanted. She, Jane Watts was a teacher and she loved kids. And she goes, not only is that not what my mom would want, that's not what I want for this kid. She goes, he's a dumb kid. He made a dumb decision and he's terrible consequences, but then nothing good will come, if he's in prison. And I think they thought she was crazy. But she persisted. She was probably, outside of my parents and my very close, family. I mean, she was probably my biggest advocate.
Jane was dead. Briar was seriously injured. The teenager who caused it would not be sent to prison. All this would not help in bringing Kip and Amanda back together. This couple, who you remember was separated at the time of the crash, would soon get divorced. Amanda says they were just too different, exemplified by the divergent ways they were reacting to the crash.
He lost my mom, but he also almost lost his daughter. I look at it as my mom went to heaven and my daughter survived.
Coming up, amidst the pain, tragedy, and division of this crash, can anything good result? Can healing or just even coping come for Jesse, Kip, and Amanda? That's next when On Accident continues. Welcome back to On Accident. I'm Chris Yaw. In November of 1820, the Essex, a famed Nantucket whaling ship, was trolling a popular feeding ground 17,000 sailing miles away in the southern seas of the Central Pacific. Sailors were on the hunt for that precious and peerless whale oil that lit the ballrooms of Europe. That's when an enormous 80-foot-long sperm whale appeared, with uncharacteristic aggression, bearing down on the Essex, a 240-ton ship, provisioned for a 2.5-year voyage. The whale took straight aim at the Essex and rammed it not once, but twice. And in no time, the renegade whale sent the ship down and sent the crew clamoring for the lifeboats. The whale attack, popularized in that book you read in school, or were supposed to read, called Moby Dick, was only the start of the tale, though, as the crew of 17 would dwindle to just 5 survivors who would make it back a year later to their Nantucket homes, having endured not just the whale attack, but endless days adrift in the open sea under a scorching sun, near starvation, cannibalism, and the deaths of close friends. Surprisingly, all 5 men, once nursed back to health, would return swiftly to the sea and to whaling, all of them eventually captaining their own whaling ships. The spirits that sustained them through their harrowing ordeals apparently emboldened them to live out their lives in relative peace, at least as much as we know. Their brutal ordeal gave few outward signs of effect, save for one sailor, Owen Chase, who had the odd habit of stashing crackers and other foodstuffs in his attic every time he returned home, and that of Essex captain George Pollard, who would go on to wreck a second ship, this time on a Pacific reef, and would again return to Nantucket and never again head out to sea, becoming a night watchman, meek, mute, and humbled. While Chase and Pollard initially recounted their ordeal, one in a book, the second in an interview with missionaries, the aftermath would be silence. Among the close-knit families of Nantucket, no one wanted to hear the tale. The fate of the Essex had touched too many lives, too closely. In fact, the veil of silence was still intact 80 years later, when a young Nantucket girl asked the aged daughter of an Essex survivor to recount the story. The old woman rose to her feet, it is reported, and said with a stern look, "Miss Molly, here we never mention the Essex." Coming to grips with the memories of fatal tragedies that shake us to the core are as varied as the people who endure them. For Kip, Amanda, and Jesse, in a time and place worlds away from the shipyards of 19th century New England, their coping with a fatal car crash would be no different.
Everything that's happened in my life from there kind of stems from that, good and bad.
As you remember, Jesse Shrake at age 16 took his friends joyriding, blew through a stop sign at 90 miles an hour, T-boned a minivan, killing 65-year-old Jane Watts, the local mayor, and seriously injuring 18-month-old Briar Reddig. Jesse avoided serious punishment thanks to the intervention of Amanda Reddig, Jane's daughter. Part of Jesse's sentence involved community service and was used creatively by law enforcement, who founded a special class for juvenile court offenders. Other teens who had received tickets for running stop signs, stop lights, or other similar traffic violations would be assigned class attendance at a 2-hour in-person program called Saving Teens' Lives, about the dangers of peer pressure and illegal driving, which was now taught by Jesse. About 140 teens go through this program every year. They hear Jesse tell his cautionary tale of teenage bravado, peer influence, and carelessness, and the class is pretty well received. When Amanda heard about it, remember her mother was killed in the crash and her daughter was seriously injured? She agreed to join Jesse, victim and perpetrator, teaching together, which made the offering even more popular and drew them together in friendship and shared appreciation for one another.
If it weren't for Amanda's forgiveness, and and I think she would even want me to definitely credit her obedience to God, because she said it wasn't her decision. She felt like God was kind of speaking through her. I'd be in prison today.
Moral injury expert David Peters says this kind of giving back, this kind of volunteering to help other offenders, is a helpful and common coping strategy.
One of the ways that many people find healing from an accidental impact that they were responsible for is through advocacy for safety.
Peters points to the reality that tragedies bring for people like Amanda, a hole in our lives that can never be filled. How can we cope with the absence? How do we move on when closure just won't happen?
Ultimately, when it comes to grief, there is no closure. When we lose someone we love, a part of us is missing. And that part of us that they were part of is going to be missing forever. There's no way we can just get that part back.
Their work with teens led to a book, self-published by Amanda, called A Blessed Tragedy, which was a hit among the locals and recounts the story of not just the crash and its aftermath, but Amanda and Jesse's desire to help others who have been affected by tragedies like theirs. For Amanda, speaking and writing on the subject certainly helped, but she did even more. As a result of the crash, she switched college majors and chose to dedicate her career to helping the vulnerable cope with fatal mistakes.
And I changed my area of study from nursing to mental health. And I work in a prison as a mental health therapist.
Amanda would pour herself not just into her work, but into her children, her daughter's recovery from serious spinal injury, and her son's mental duress. Briar has made remarkable strides, and there are few noticeable physical vestiges of her injuries. And Calvin, you remember Calvin? He was 10 years old at the time of the crash, which rocked his world, and he continued to have a very difficult time.
He dealt with some addiction issues. He struggled academically severely in academics, and just in finding acceptance and validation, I think, for what he went through in that time frame, and then what he lost going forward.
As we hear Amanda's story of how in an instant a crash could affect her life so dramatically, her mother gone, her daughter seriously injured, her son devastated, then the change in her responsibilities with her father's dementia care, her divorce, her change in careers, her entire life turned upside down. Amanda says the most helpful way of coping was remember the word Deodand, literally giving it to God, although not selling a horse or even car wreckage, but the battered emotions, shattered dreams, and dashed hopes. Over and over, time and again, Amanda says turning to her higher power, her source of solace, gave her strength.
God just kind of had his way with my heart.
In time, this divine giving over, modernized Deodand, would spread. Jesse's immediate aftermath was dogged by a wide range of emotions. Shame, remorse, guilt, anger, depression. He says the crash turned him into a bitter, arrogant, if not unapproachable teen. In addition to Jane's death and Briar's injuries, Jesse's passenger in the crash, his best friend, who was a gifted athlete, was so seriously injured he would no longer be able to go to college and play football. These realities stalked Jesse.
Someone died because of me. This little girl, has some lifelong injuries, some issues that she's gonna have forever, and she almost died because of me. My best friend almost died because of me.
Seeing Jesse's pain, his parents immediately called a counselor, and as mentioned, Jesse launched headlong into therapy. He would go 2 to 3 times a week for the next 2 years, all through high school. Slowly but surely, narrative therapy, as it's called, worked.
If I talk about it, if I bring light to a dark situation, it wouldn't be as dark.
The crash would also influence Jesse's choice of colleges. He purposely selected a university with a no-alcohol policy to help him stick with the no-drinking rule of his probation. Jesse says that starting over at a new place, one that did not know him or his past, really helped. His high school girlfriend played no small role either. Jesse says one of the few people who stayed loyal to him other than Amanda was his high school sweetheart, whom he married. They now have a family, and Jesse says these new responsibilities are what helps keep him healthy.
I have 2 kids that rely on me, and I could either sit in a pit and think about the terrible things that have come from my decisions, or I can say, I can take responsibility for them and say they happened. I need to use these to teach my sons. I need to use these to teach other people.
Turning this corner would not be as quick or easy with Kip. As you remember, he was one of the first at the scene of the crash and saw the mangled van where his mother-in-law died and his daughter was nearly killed by Jesse's carelessness.
You can call it negligent, you can call it reckless. That was the big argument on prosecution. I'll call it both.
For Kip, the immediate aftermath of the crash was filled with anger. More than once, he wanted to confront Jesse and give him a piece of his mind.
I hate to admit that there were times that I hoped I crossed paths with him. I wanted to run into him.
As we've heard, Kip initially turned to alcohol and became so mad and bitter he lost friends, and he may have even lost his job had not a coworker named Rick come across his path. Rick was a hard-working mason who bonded with Kip as they worked together on a home repair and remodeling project. Rick had a gentle and unassuming manner, and over time, in a non-judgmental way, he explained to Kip about the reality of unforgiveness, how damaging it could be, and how it could eat him alive.
It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be upset, but you don't need to be like that all the time. You're killing yourself.
Rick would turn Kip onto a radio preacher who he would listen to regularly and came to enjoy. This motivated Kip to find a church, which he did, and a pastor, Pastor Dave, who Kip says has really helped him process the crash. All this thanks to Rick, the mason, who convinced Kip that the only way forward was to give his pain and suffering over to God.
Had I not run into Rick, I can't tell you what my life would have become or may have ended up or how I would have been. I really can't. I can tell you, though, it wouldn't be as good as where I am now.
Forgiveness is a challenge, an aspiration, a difficult road, largely dependent on the size of the offense. And when it's death and injury of a family member, forgiveness can border impossibility. Making it even more difficult is when the offender won't apologize or ask for forgiveness. This was Kip's impression of Jesse. Kip felt disrespected and ignored.
He never once tried to approach me. He never once tried to contact me. He could have sent me a letter. He could have sent me a text. He could have done anything to have approached me and said, "I'm sorry," but I've never heard those words out of his mouth ever.
This ate away at Kip. This is what he needed to let go. Therapist Nidra Glover-Tawwab says that while forgiveness is never required, it almost always makes us feel better, and that with forgiveness, we gift ourselves with peace. This is something Amanda seemed to grasp right away and wishes Kip could find.
I worry that harboring anger is going to hurt his heart. I would love for him to be able to say, "I forgive Jesse," and that he, wishes Jesse well, as corny as that may sound.
Of course, forgiveness is not a pass for what's been done or an opportunity for the offender to have access to us, but forgiveness is a release so that the offender no longer owns our energy, our attention, our peace of mind. Forgiveness allows us to let go of the hold they have over us and can allow us to let go of at least a significant amount of resentment, anger, rage, and fear. And while forgiveness is difficult and uncomfortable, It can be even more uncomfortable to hold on to those negative emotions. Writer Anne Lamott famously says that unforgiveness is like eating rat poison and waiting for the rat to die, which is what Kip seems to be doing, withholding forgiveness until he gets an apology.
And even after his 3, 4, 5 years even after that, of all his healing and doing what he's doing, I have not heard a word to this day.
But apologies aren't always forthcoming. There are a lot of reasons why people don't apologize. There are some people who won't apologize even when the facts are right in front of them. Some people won't apologize because of their ego. Some people will break if they admit the truth. Some people will only apologize with actions and not words. And some people just don't have the tools to be accountable for their actions. Jesse admits he could have done better, but that he was scared of Kip and was avoiding a confrontation. Today, though, Jesse says that's not the case for him. While he did apologize in court, he points out, he would now do it again because maturity and fatherhood have allowed him to put himself in Kip's shoes.
Until I became a dad, I didn't understand his anger. That's, I think, maybe the moment that I was like, I think I get Kip a little bit. I think I understand a little bit. Because even going through what we've went through and knowing what I know, if some dumb teenager does something like that and it puts my 18-month-old, or my 2-year-old in the ditch, I don't know. I want to say that I would react much more like Amanda. But I think that you never know until something like that happens.
Whether or not an apology comes is yet to be seen. When I last spoke with Jesse and Kip, which was more than 10 years after the crash, neither were opposed to the idea. This is where we can see how the years tend to soften us to such things, and the healthy use of religion can serve as a helpful lubricant. This brings us back to Deodand and that medieval concept of giving over something of value that had played a role in unintentional harm, in acknowledgement of the accidental world in which we live, as a penance of sorts to the gods, to be used in service of the greater good. It is a form of surrendering to the capricious, the unexplainable, the incomprehensible, and in this case, perhaps that would mean apology and reconciliation, two expensive and valuable commodities. With time and a grounded sense of self, we get a wider understanding of the breadth and wonder of life, how our joys and pains, triumphs and tragedies, rejoicing and grief shape us, mold us, and can ultimately form us into better people.
And this is the hard lesson of grief, that ultimately the kinds of things that make us who we are, that make us loving and empathetic people and kind people and patient people, are often these kinds of things that do incredible moral damage to our own soul and to others.
This was On Accident. I'm Chris Yaw. If you or someone you know is suffering under the weight of unintentional harm, there is help. The Hyacinth Fellowship is a nonprofit support group that gets you. We are the largest organization in the world devoted to helping those who unintentionally kill or harm others get the help they need. Contact us at hyacinthfellowship.org.